The morning sun cast long shadows across Victoria Reynolds' expansive bedroom. She stood at her floor-to-ceiling window, watching workers file into the Reynolds industrial complex below. Her reflection in the glass showed a young woman dressed in designer clothes, but her eyes held a weariness that designer brands couldn't mask. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. The mansion's isolation felt suffocating. Victoria checked her phone. 3 missed calls from her father's assistant about tonight's charity gala, and 2 messages about board meeting preparations. She deleted them all without reading. Below, a group of factory workers laughed together as they entered the building. Victoria pressed her hand against the cool glass, studying their easy camaraderie. Their genuine interactions contrasted sharply with the artificial pleasantries she endured at social functions. That morning, something shifted in Victoria. She'd spent years feeling like an ornament in her father's empire, wheeled out for photographs and social events. The constant pressure to maintain appearances, to be the perfect heiress, had created a void she couldn't ignore anymore. In her walk-in closet, Victoria pushed past racks of evening gowns and suits. At the back, she found what she needed: simple jeans and a plain shirt she'd bought on a rare solo shopping trip. She changed quickly, studying herself in the mirror. Without the trappings of wealth, she looked different, younger, more like herself. The factory floor access card wasn't hard to obtain. She'd taken it from her father's study weeks ago, sensing she might need it someday. Victoria's heart raced as she drove her least conspicuous car to the employee parking lot, mixing in with the morning shift workers. Inside the factory, the energy was electric. Machinery hummed, people called out to each other over the noise, and the air smelled of metal and oil. Victoria absorbed everything, feeling more alive than she had in months. She followed the flow of workers, trying to mimic their confident movements. That's when she saw him. A mechanic was working on a malfunctioning assembly line, his movements precise and focused. Victoria watched as he diagnosed the problem, fascinated by his expertise. When the machine jammed again, she found herself walking over. "Need any help?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He looked up, and Victoria's breath caught. His eyes were kind, with smile lines at the corners. Grease smudged his cheek, but it only added to his authentic charm. "Sure," he said, grinning. "I'm Daniel. You must be new here." Victoria nodded, giving the fake name she'd prepared. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but necessary. Daniel showed her how to clear the jam, explaining the mechanism with genuine enthusiasm. His passion for his work was evident in every word. They worked together for several minutes, their hands occasionally brushing. Each contact sent electricity through Victoria's body. When the machine finally roared back to life, Daniel's triumphant smile made her heart skip. "Thanks for the help," he said. "Maybe I'll see you around." Victoria nodded, already knowing she'd find reasons to return. As she walked away, she felt Daniel's eyes following her. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as the Reynolds heiress, but as herself. That evening, as Victoria prepared for another tedious social event, she kept thinking about the factory floor's energy, about Daniel's smile, about the possibility of something real in her carefully manufactured world. She didn't know it yet, but that day would mark the beginning of a journey that would shake her family's empire to its core. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's morning routine changed dramatically. She'd leave her mansion before dawn, change in her car, and slip into the factory with the early shift workers. Her growing friendship with Daniel became the highlight of her days. During their shared lunch break, they sat in a quiet corner of the factory cafeteria. Daniel unwrapped a homemade sandwich, while Victoria picked at the same pre-packaged meal she'd seen other workers buy. "I've been saving," Daniel said, his eyes lighting up as he spoke. "Almost have enough for a down payment on this old garage across town. Needs work, but..." He pulled out his phone, showing Victoria pictures of a weathered building with potential beneath its worn exterior. "What would you do with it?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. The passion in his voice was contagious. Custom restorations, mainly. There's a market for it, and I've got the skills. Just need the chance to prove it. He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Sorry, I probably sound ridiculous, dreaming this big. Victoria shook her head. No, it's not ridiculous at all. It's refreshing. She meant it. His dreams weren't handed to him. They were earned through hard work and determination. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp voice. Victoria Reynolds. Victoria's blood ran cold. Standing behind them was Margaret Chen, her father's head of PR and a family friend. Margaret's perfectly manicured eyebrows were raised in shock. "Excuse us," Victoria said to Daniel, quickly leading Margaret away from the cafeteria. In an empty corridor, Margaret confronted her. "Have you lost your mind? Do you know what would happen if the press got wind of this? Reynolds, heiress, slums it with factory workers." "It's not like that," Victoria defended. But Margaret cut her off. "Your father has worked too hard building this company's reputation for you to destroy it with whatever identity crisis this is. You have responsibilities, Victoria. Real ones. Not this working-class fantasy you're playing out." The words stung because they held a grain of truth. Victoria was living a lie, but not in the way Margaret thought. Before she could respond, an alert on her phone caught her attention. It was an email she'd been accidentally copied on, intended for her father's eyes only. Margaret was still lecturing, but Victoria wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes scanned the email's contents, and her stomach dropped. Phrases jumped out at her. Weapons development, classified contracts, lethal capacity. "Are you even listening to me?" Margaret demanded. Victoria looked up from her phone, her mind racing. "Yes, I hear you. I'll think about what you said." The dismissal was clear in her voice. Margaret left with a disapproving glare, but Victoria barely noticed. She reread the email, her hands shaking slightly. The Reynolds Industrial Complex had always manufactured industrial equipment and machinery. When had they started developing weapons? And why hadn't she known about it? Back in the cafeteria, Daniel was cleaning up their lunch spot. He looked up when she returned, concern evident on his face. "Everything okay?" Victoria forced a smile. "Just someone who recognized me from before. It wasn't exactly a lie. Seems like it rattled you," Daniel observed quietly. Victoria sat down, her mind still on the email. She looked at Daniel, honest, hard-working Daniel, and wondered what he would think if he knew the truth about her identity, about her family's company, about the weapons being developed somewhere in this very building. "Daniel," she started, then hesitated. "Have you ever discovered something about your job that made you question everything?" He studied her face carefully. "Can't say that I have, but I get the feeling you have." Victoria nodded slowly. "I think I'm going to need to dig deeper into something that could be dangerous." "Whatever it is," Daniel said, his voice firm, "be careful. And know that you can trust me if you need help." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. She wanted to tell him everything, about who she really was, about the email, about her growing feelings for him. Instead, she just nodded, knowing that every day she spent with him only made her eventual unmasking more painful. As she left the factory that evening, Victoria's mind was a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The weapons development had to be investigated, but doing so meant risking everything. Her relationship with her father, the company's reputation, and most painfully, her connection with Daniel. The Reynolds Industrial Complex looked different to Victoria now. Every corridor held potential secrets. Every closed door, another possibility for concealing weapons development. She spent her lunch break with Daniel in their usual spot, picking at her food while her mind raced. "You're somewhere else today," Daniel observed, wiping his hands on his work pants. His concern was evident, but he didn't push. Victoria set down her untouched sandwich. "If you discovered something wrong happening here, what would you do?" Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Define wrong. Something that could hurt people. Something that goes against everything this company claims to stand for." Victoria watched his reaction carefully. I'd investigate, he said without hesitation. Gather evidence. Make sure I understood what was really happening before making any moves. He studied her face. Is this about what's been bothering you? Victoria nodded slowly. I need to look into something, but I can't tell you exactly what yet. It's complicated. Just be careful, Daniel warned. Big companies like this, they have ways of dealing with people who ask too many questions. If only he knew she was part of that same corporate structure he was warning her about. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the factory's PA system. Victoria Reynolds, please report to the executive office immediately. Victoria's heart stopped. Had they discovered her disguise? But no, this was a message for her real identity, not her factory worker persona. She made an excuse to Daniel about needing to check something and hurried to change into the spare business outfit she kept in her car. 20 minutes later, she stepped into her father's office. Richard Reynolds stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, much like Victoria often did in her room. The similarity ended there, where she sought connection with the world below. He surveyed his domain. Victoria, he turned, smiling. I hear you've been spending time at the factory. She forced herself to remain calm. I thought it was time I learned more about the business from the ground up. Excellent initiative. His praise surprised her. That's exactly the kind of thinking I need from my successor. Though, he paused, his smile tightening. I'd prefer if you coordinated such visits through proper channels. We have protocols for a reason. Of course, Father. Victoria kept her voice steady. I've learned a lot already. Good, because it's time we discussed your larger role in the company. He handed her a folder. The board meeting next month. I want you to present our new development initiatives. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Would the weapons program be included? But the documents were all standard industrial projects. Nothing about what she'd discovered in the email. I need to know you're ready for this responsibility, her father continued. The Reynolds name carries weight. Everything we do affects thousands of lives. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Victoria. And if I discovered something that could negatively affect those lives? Her father's expression hardened slightly. Then you would bring that concern to me directly. That's what family does. His tone carried a warning. That evening, after everyone had left, Victoria used her access card to enter the factory floor. The machinery stood silent, casting long shadows in the emergency lighting. She needed to find proof of the weapons program, something concrete she could use to understand the full scope of what was happening. As she moved through the darkened factory, Victoria thought about Daniel's warning about companies dealing with people who asked questions. She thought about her father's subtle threat about family loyalty. She thought about the thousands of workers whose lives could be affected by what she discovered. A security guard's flashlight beam swept across the floor ahead. Victoria pressed herself against a wall, heart pounding. As she stood there in the darkness, she realized there was no going back. Whatever she discovered tonight would change everything. Her relationship with her father, her role in the company, and most painfully, her connection with Daniel, who still thought she was just another factory worker. The guard's footsteps faded. Victoria pulled out her phone, using its light to guide her way deeper into the factory's shadows, toward whatever truth awaited her. The restricted section of the factory occupied the building's northeast corner, separated from the main production floor by keycard-accessible doors and security cameras. Victoria had noticed workers avoiding the area, their eyes skating past it, as if trained not to look too closely. During her nighttime exploration, she'd identified a suspicious door, thicker than the others, with additional security measures. But she couldn't risk accessing it alone. After a sleepless night, she approached Daniel during their morning break. I need your help with something, she said quietly, checking that no one was within earshot. But it's not exactly authorized. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, studying her face. This about what you've been investigating? Victoria nodded. There's a room in the restricted section. Something's happening there that people need to know about, but I can't get in alone. You're talking about breaking into a secured area. Daniel stated flatly. That's not just against company policy, it's illegal. What if something illegal was already happening behind that door? Daniel was silent for a long moment. Tonight, after second shift, I have an access card that will get us through the main security doors. That evening, they met in the empty parking lot. Daniel had changed from his work clothes into dark pants and a black shirt. Victoria had done the same, her hair tucked under a cap. Last chance to back out, she offered. Daniel shook his head. Whatever's going on, you're not facing it alone. They moved through the darkened factory like shadows. Victoria's access card got them through the first set of doors, but the reinforced door presented a bigger challenge. Daniel examined the electronic lock. It's a Millennium series, he muttered. These have a maintenance override for emergencies. His fingers moved quickly, removing the front panel. I've repaired enough of these to know their weaknesses. Minutes later, the lock clicked. Victoria's heart pounded as Daniel eased the door open. The room beyond was filled with computers and technical drawings, but it was the prototype on the central table that made them both freeze. It looked like a standard industrial drilling component, but Victoria recognized the modifications from the email specifications. This wasn't meant for mining or construction. It was designed to penetrate armored vehicles. This is military tech, Daniel whispered, examining the prototype. But Reynolds Industrial is a civilian manufacturer. Victoria moved to the computers, her fingers flying over keyboards. Files populated the screens. Contracts, designs, testing data. The weapons program was larger than she'd imagined. Look at this, she called Daniel over. They're disguising weapons components as industrial equipment, shipping them through shell companies to bypass international restrictions. Daniel's expression darkened as he read. This could get people killed. A lot of people. He turned to her. How did you know to look here? Victoria hesitated. The moment demanded honesty, but revealing her identity now could destroy his trust. Before she could respond, a noise outside made them both freeze. Security guards. Their voices carried through the door, along with the sound of approaching footsteps. Daniel quickly closed the computer files, while Victoria gathered what evidence she could photograph with her phone. They slipped out through a side door seconds before the guards entered the room. Hidden in an alcove, they held their breath as the guards passed. Victoria was acutely aware of Daniel's proximity, of his steady presence beside her. When the guards' footsteps faded, they made their way back through the factory in tense silence. In the parking lot, safety finally reached. Daniel turned to her. We have proof now. What's the next step? Victoria looked at her phone, at the damning evidence it contained. We need allies. People we can trust inside the factory. This is bigger than just us now. Whoever's behind this won't give up their operation easily, Daniel warned. They'll come after anyone who threatens to expose them. Victoria thought of her father, of his warning about family loyalty. She thought of the weapons being shipped under false labels, of the lives at risk. And she thought of Daniel, now involved because he trusted her, trusted a lie. We need to be careful who we tell, she said finally. But we can't stay silent. Not about this. Daniel nodded, his expression determined. Whatever happens next, we're in this together. As Victoria drove home, her phone heavy with evidence in her pocket, she realized there was no turning back. She'd crossed a line tonight, and the consequences would affect not just her, but everyone she cared about, including Daniel, who still didn't know he was helping the company owner's daughter expose her own father's crimes. The factory's break room had become their sanctuary. Victoria sat across from Daniel, both of them speaking in low voices, despite the noise of machinery masking their conversation. The evidence they'd gathered weighed heavily between them. I need to tell you something, Victoria started, her heart racing. The guilt of her deception had become unbearable. But before she could continue, Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Whatever it is, can it wait? His eyes held genuine concern. You look like you haven't slept in days. He wasn't wrong. Victoria had spent nights poring over the photographs from the restricted room, tracing shell companies, connecting dots. But it wasn't just the investigation keeping her awake. It was the growing weight of her double life, the warmth of Daniel's hand in hers, built on a foundation of lies. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words surprising her with their honesty. "About what we found, about what happens next, about," she squeezed his hand, "about us." "Hey," Daniel's voice softened, "we'll figure this out together." A shadow fell across their table. Victoria looked up to see Marcus Chen, her father's new VP of Operations, standing over them. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Daniel Rogers." Marcus's gaze fixed on their joined hands before they could pull apart. "Interesting company you're keeping." Victoria felt Daniel stiffen beside her. "Can I help you, sir?" "Just reviewing personnel files. Seems you've been logging unusual hours lately, accessing areas outside your clearance level." Marcus's tone remained conversational, but the threat was clear. "I go where maintenance is needed," Daniel replied evenly. "Of course," Marcus nodded. "Just remember, curiosity can be dangerous in our line of work." He walked away, leaving a chill in his wake. That evening, Victoria waited in her father's study. The room's dark wood paneling and leather-bound books had once represented security. Now they felt suffocating. Richard Reynolds entered, his surprise at seeing her quickly masked. "Victoria, I didn't expect you tonight. We need to talk about the weapons program." Her father's expression didn't change. He poured himself a drink, his movements deliberate. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, don't lie to me." Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "I saw the prototypes, the contracts. What you're doing isn't just unethical, it's illegal. What I'm doing," her father set down his glass carefully, "is securing our company's future, your future, by manufacturing weapons disguised as industrial equipment, by putting lives at risk, by adapting to market realities." His voice hardened. "The world isn't as simple as you think, Victoria. Sometimes maintaining our position requires difficult decisions. Decisions that could get people killed. Decisions that protect our interests." He moved closer, his voice softening. "You're my daughter, my heir. Everything I do is to ensure you have a strong company to inherit." Victoria felt tears threatening. A company built on lies. A company built to survive. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're young, idealistic, but you need to understand, there are no clean hands in this business. Only survivors and casualties." She stepped away from his touch. "And which category does Daniel Rogers fall into?" Her father's expression shifted. "Ah, so that's what this is about. Your little factory floor romance. Don't. He's being transferred, effective immediately, to our facility in Phoenix." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "You can't do that." "I can, and I have. It's for the best, Victoria. You're a Reynolds. It's time you remembered what that means." She left his study in a daze, her phone buzzing with a message from Daniel. "We need to talk. Something's happened." Victoria stood in the mansion's hallway, surrounded by portraits of Reynolds' generations past. Each face seemed to watch her, judging her choices. Her father's words echoed, survivors and casualties. She looked at Daniel's message again, knowing that her response would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she made her choice. Between being a Reynolds and being true to herself. Between protecting the empire and protecting what was right. The weight of generations pressed down on her as she typed her reply, knowing that whatever she chose, someone she cared about would get hurt. They met in an all-night diner far from the factory, where the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces. Daniel's transfer papers sat between them like a bomb waiting to detonate. "Phoenix," Daniel said flatly. "Effective next week. No warning, no explanation." He looked up at Victoria. "This isn't a coincidence." Victoria stared at her untouched coffee. "No, it's not." Before she could continue, her phone buzzed. A message from Tom Parker, One of the maintenance workers who'd been asking questions about the restricted area just got fired. Security escorted me out. Need to talk. They're cleaning house, Daniel said, reading the message over her shoulder. First they tried to get rid of me, now Tom. Victoria's guilt threatened to suffocate her. These were real people, with real lives and families, being punished because of her investigation, because she'd pulled them into her fight without telling them the whole truth. We need to move faster, she said, before anyone else gets hurt. Move faster how? We're maintenance workers. They're corporate executives with armies of lawyers. Daniel's frustration was evident. Even with the evidence we have, who's going to listen? Victoria took a deep breath. The moment she'd been dreading had arrived. There's something you need to know. The diner's door chimed. Marcus Chen walked in, followed by 2 security guards. Victoria's heart stopped. Miss Reynolds, Marcus said loudly enough for other patrons to hear. Your father's been worried about you. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Victoria's. The betrayal in his expression cut deeper than any words could have. Reynolds, he whispered. Daniel, I can explain. Save it. He stood abruptly. I should have known this was too good to be true. Please, just let me, Miss Reynolds, Marcus interrupted. Your father insists you come with us. Now. Victoria remained seated. Tell my father I'll be home when I'm finished here. Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping. That wasn't a request. Mr. Reynolds is concerned about your judgment lately. He's arranged for you to take a short vacation. To clear your head. The implied threat was clear. Victoria looked at Daniel, but he was already walking away, pushing past the security guards without a backward glance. Back at the mansion, Victoria found her father waiting in his study. The room felt smaller than ever. It's for your own good, he said before she could speak. A few weeks at the lake house will help you regain perspective. You mean it will keep me quiet until the weapons deal goes through? Her father sighed. Victoria, you're not thinking clearly. These workers you've befriended, they've filled your head with paranoid ideas. I saw the evidence with my own eyes. You saw what you wanted to see, what that mechanic wanted you to see. His name is Daniel, Victoria snapped. And he didn't want me to see anything. I dragged him into this. I lied to him, to protect company interests. I hope. Victoria laughed bitterly. No, because I wanted something real in my life, just once. Her father's expression softened marginally. You're young. There will be other men. Appropriate men. This isn't about Daniel. Victoria's voice rose. It's about what's right. About people's lives. Enough. Her father slammed his hand on the desk. You will go to the lake house. You will stay there until this contract is signed. And you will never contact that mechanic again. Am I clear? Victoria stood, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Crystal clear. And now I'm clear too, about exactly what kind of man you are. She left the study, her mind racing. They'd try to force her into a car tomorrow, ship her off to the lake house like a problematic child, but they'd underestimated her. She still had the evidence on her phone. She still had allies in the factory, even if Daniel would never trust her again. Most importantly, she had something her father didn't expect. Nothing left to lose. In her room, Victoria began to plan. The weapons contract signing was in 3 days. Her father thought he was protecting his legacy, but he'd forgotten something crucial. She was a Reynolds too, and she'd learned from the best how to play this game. She just hoped that when the dust settled, there would be something worth salvaging from the wreckage she was about to create. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Victoria's security detail arrived to escort her to the lake house. They found her room empty, the bed unslept in. By the time they raised the alarm, she was already executing her plan from a budget motel on the outskirts of town. Her laptop glowed with dozens of open tabs, corporate financial records, shipping manifests, and email chains she'd spent the night collecting. Victoria had grown up watching her father build his empire. She knew where to look for the weak points. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom Parker. Half the maintenance crew got pink slips this morning. Daniel's still here, but they've got him isolated in the East Wing. Victoria's throat tightened. They were keeping Daniel around as leverage, knowing she might try to contact him. Her father was nothing if not tactical. The annual Reynolds family dinner was scheduled for that evening, a tradition before major contract signings. Victoria knew her absence would infuriate her father, but she had more pressing concerns. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she compiled the evidence into a comprehensive document. A knock at her motel door made her freeze. Then, a familiar voice. "Victoria, it's Margaret." Victoria opened the door cautiously. Margaret Chen stood there, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the seedy motel setting. "Your father's furious," Margaret said, stepping inside. "He's convinced Daniel corrupted you somehow." "Of course he is," Victoria replied bitterly. "Heaven forbid his daughter actually think for herself." Margaret's expression softened. "I've known you since you were a child, Victoria. This isn't you. Running away, hiding in motels, consorting with factory workers." "You're right." Victoria met her eyes. The old Victoria would have stayed quiet, played her part, but I can't do that anymore. She turned her laptop screen toward Margaret. "Look at this. Really look." Margaret scanned the documents, her professional mask cracking slightly. "These weapons, the shell companies. If this gets out, it will destroy the company," Victoria finished. "Unless someone stops it now, what are you planning?" "I'm going to the family dinner tonight, and I'm bringing evidence that not even my father can ignore." Margaret ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "He'll try to stop you, I know." Victoria's voice was steady. "That's why I need your help." Meanwhile, at the factory, Daniel worked in isolation, his mind racing. The truth about Victoria's identity had hit him like a physical blow, but something wasn't adding up. If she'd been spying for her father, why were they trying so hard to keep them apart? A security guard watched his every move as he repaired machinery. Daniel had seen too many colleagues escorted out over the past day to risk any suspicious behavior. But his phone burned in his pocket. Victoria's last message unread. "I never lied about what matters." Back at the motel, Victoria prepared for the dinner. She'd chosen a simple black dress, a far cry from her usual designer wear. Her hand trembled slightly as she applied lipstick, remembering all the family dinners where she'd played the perfect heiress. Margaret returned with the items Victoria had requested. "Security will be tight," she warned. "Your father's paranoid about leaks before tomorrow's contract signing." "Good," Victoria said, checking her phone one last time. Still no response from Daniel. He should be paranoid. As darkness fell, Victoria stood in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the carefree heiress or the undercover factory worker. She was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of hard truths and harder choices. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number, but she knew who it was. "I read your message. We need to talk." Victoria's heart leaped, but she forced herself to focus. The family dinner awaited, and with it, the confrontation that would change everything. Daniel would have to wait. First, she had to face her father and the empire of lies he'd built. As she got into Margaret's car, Victoria thought about all the workers who'd lost their jobs, about Daniel's betrayed expression in the diner, about her father's casual dismissal of human lives as mere business calculations. The Reynolds mansion loomed ahead, its windows glowing with warm light that promised family and tradition. But Victoria knew better now. Behind those windows, a war was about to begin, and she was bringing the ammunition. The Reynolds mansion's grand dining room buzzed with pre-dinner conversation. Victoria stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching through the partially open door as board members and family associates mingled, champagne glasses in hand. Her father held court at the center, every inch the successful patriarch. Her phone vibrated again. "Daniel, I'm at the factory gates. Security's doubled, but I found something you need to see." Time sensitive, Victoria's carefully constructed plan trembled at the edges. The evidence she'd compiled was damning, but if Daniel had found something new, he's expecting you to make a scene at dinner. Margaret whispered beside her. Security has orders to remove you if necessary. Let them try. Victoria's fingers tightened around her phone. But first, I need 30 minutes. Can you stall? Margaret nodded, already moving toward the dining room. Moments later, Victoria heard her announcing that dinner would be slightly delayed due to a catering issue. The factory was a 10-minute drive. Victoria's heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the gates, her black dress making her nearly invisible in the evening shadows. Daniel waited by the maintenance entrance, his face unreadable. 5 minutes, she said before he could speak. That's all I can give you. You're wearing a cocktail dress at a factory, he noted flatly. Another disguise. The barb stung, but she deserved it. No more disguises, no more lies. She met his eyes. What did you find? Daniel pulled out his phone, showing her photos. They're moving everything tonight. Not waiting for the contract signing. Tom noticed unusual truck movement before they fired him. Victoria studied the images. Loading docks active after hours. Unmarked trucks. Workers she didn't recognize. They knew I had evidence. They're clearing out before I can expose them. There's more. Daniel's voice was grim. I overheard Marcus Chen. The weapons aren't just being moved, they're being delivered. Tonight, the contract signing tomorrow is just theater. Victoria's blood ran cold. Where? Don't know. But Victoria, he hesitated. Your father was on the call with Marcus. He's orchestrating all of it. Of course he was. Victoria checked her watch. 20 minutes until dinner. I have to get back to expose everything at your family dinner. Daniel's tone was skeptical. They'll shut you down before you can speak. Not if I have proof of active weapons transport happening right now. She met his eyes. Help me one last time. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Why should I trust you? Because I lied about my name, but never about who I am, or how I feel. Victoria held out her hand. And because right now, we're the only ones who can stop this. Back at the mansion, dinner was finally being served. Victoria slipped into her seat, noting the additional security personnel positioned around the room. Her father's smile was razor sharp. So glad you could join us, daughter. His tone carried a warning. I trust you've had time to reflect. Oh, I have. Victoria smiled back, equally sharp. Around the table, conversations dimmed as family members sensed the tension. In fact, I'd like to propose a toast. Her father's hand tightened around his wine glass. On Victoria's phone, hidden in her lap, messages from Daniel appeared. Trucks heading north on Industry Road. Got license plates and driver names. Following at safe distance. Victoria stood, champagne glass in hand. Security shifted, ready to move. But before anyone could stop her, she spoke. To the Reynolds legacy. 2 family secrets. Her voice carried across the suddenly silent room. And to the convoy of illegal weapons currently leaving our factory, which federal authorities are tracking as we speak. The glass in her father's hand shattered. The dining room erupted into chaos. Board members whispered urgently into phones. Security personnel touched their earpieces, and Richard Reynolds stood frozen, blood from his cut hand dripping onto the white tablecloth. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Victoria held up her phone, showing the live location tracking of the weapons convoy. Am I? Daniel's following the trucks right now. Funny how firing half the maintenance staff made it easy for him to access loading dock security footage. Enough. Her father's roar silenced the room. Everyone, out. Now. Board members scrambled to leave, but Victoria's voice cut through the movement. Stay. You should hear this. After all, you're all complicit. Margaret Chen, standing by the door, gave Victoria a subtle nod. The evidence was being uploaded to multiple secure servers as they spoke. You have no idea what you're doing, her father said, his voice dangerously quiet. The implications of selling illegal weapons through shell companies, of endangering thousands of lives. Victoria's voice remained steady. Or the implications of lying to our board about where their investment money was really going, that got their attention. Board members slowly sank back into their seats. Everything I've done, Richard Reynolds spoke through gritted teeth, was to protect this company. Your inheritance. No. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. Everything you've done was to protect your power, your control. She turned to the board members. Check your emails. You'll find comprehensive documentation of every illegal weapons sale, every shell company, every falsified shipping manifest. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel, convoy stopped at checkpoint. Federal agents moving in. Victoria's father must have received the same news, because his face went ashen. He reached for the phone on his belt, but Margaret stepped forward. Security teams have been stood down, sir, she said calmly. My authority as head of PR, you betrayed me. He stared at her in disbelief. I chose to protect the company. Margaret's voice was firm. From you. Victoria watched as the reality of his situation dawned on her father's face. The carefully constructed walls of his empire were crumbling, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Victoria, he tried one last time, his voice softening. You're my daughter. Everything I built was for you. I never wanted your empire, father. She felt tears threatening but held them back. I just wanted you to do what's right. The dining room doors burst open. Federal agents flooded in, followed by Daniel. His eyes met Victoria's across the chaos, and in that moment, all the lies and disguises between them fell away. Richard Reynolds, the lead agent, announced, "You're under arrest for illegal weapons trafficking, fraud, and multiple violations of international arms treaties." Victoria watched as they led her father away in handcuffs. Board members huddled with their lawyers. Security personnel stood down, and the Grand Reynolds dining room, the scene of so many carefully orchestrated family performances, descended into controlled chaos. Daniel approached her slowly. The convoy's been seized. All drivers are in custody. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in me, even after. I didn't believe in you at first, he admitted. But then I remembered something. The way you talked about doing what's right, about wanting something real. He paused. That wasn't an act. Before Victoria could respond, a board member approached urgently. Miss Reynolds, with your father's arrest, the company needs immediate leadership to handle this crisis. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. But this time, it was her choice to bear it. Give me a moment, she told the board member. Then, to Daniel, I know I don't have the right to ask, but I could use someone I trust, someone who knows the real me. Daniel looked around the opulent dining room, at the chaos they'd created together. The real you, huh? A small smile played at his lips. I think I'm just starting to meet her. In the days following Richard Reynolds' arrest, the mansion's grand office became Victoria's command center. She sat behind the desk that had intimidated her throughout her childhood, now seeing it as just furniture, nothing more. The preliminary audit results are in, Margaret announced, placing a thick folder on the desk. The weapons program's tentacles ran deeper than we thought. Nearly a third of our international contracts were compromised. Victoria rubbed her temples. And the employees, most of the fired workers have been reinstated, with back pay. Margaret smiled slightly, including a particularly stubborn maintenance supervisor. As if on cue, Daniel appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes. The contrast between his practical attire and the office's luxury somehow made the room feel more real, more grounded. Your 3 o'clock is here, he said, then added with a hint of irony, Ms. Reynolds. Victoria stood. The workers' council meeting. Walk with me. They moved through the factory floor together, a path that felt different now. Workers nodded at them, not with the fearful deference they'd shown her father, but with cautious respect. The East Wing conversion is ahead of schedule, Daniel reported. Once we're done, it'll be our biggest renewable energy research facility. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Well, Daniel smiled. Someone did offer me a position as head of sustainable engineering. They reached the conference room where the workers' council waited. Before entering, Victoria caught Daniel's hand. I never properly thanked you for that night at the dinner, for believing in me when you had every reason not to. You know what convinced me? He turned to face her. When you stood up to your father, you weren't thinking about the company or your inheritance. You were thinking about the people who would be hurt by those weapons. A commotion down the hall interrupted them. One of the board members rushed up, waving a tablet. Victoria, your father's lawyer just released a statement. He's claiming you orchestrated everything to seize control of the company. It's all over the news. Victoria took the tablet, reading the accusations. Her father's final play, painting her as a manipulative usurper who betrayed her own family for power. He still doesn't get it, she said quietly. This was never about control. What are you going to do? The board member asked anxiously. Victoria handed the tablet back, straightening her shoulders. Call a press conference. But first, I have a workers' council meeting to attend. You're not worried about your father's accusations? Daniel asked as they entered the conference room. The truth isn't in press statements or legal documents, Victoria replied. It's here, in what we build next. She surveyed the room of workers' representatives. Faces she knew now, people whose lives and families she understood. My father built an empire on secrets and fear. I want to build something different. The final surprise came later that afternoon. The detective handling her father's case arrived with an unexpected revelation. Evidence that the rival executive, who'd been pressuring the weapons program, had been working with federal authorities for months. He knew the weapons deal would implode, Victoria realized. He was positioning himself to take over when it did. Except you got there first, Daniel noted. Victoria looked out over the factory floor, where workers were already converting weapons manufacturing lines to civilian use. No, she corrected him. We got here first. The sun was setting as they left the office that evening, casting long shadows across the factory grounds. Victoria stopped by her old observation window, but this time she wasn't looking down at an unreachable world. She was looking at a future she'd helped create. So, Daniel said beside her, still feeling trapped by expectations. Victoria smiled, taking his hand. The only expectations I care about now are the ones we set for ourselves. She turned to face him, ready to build something real. His answer was a kiss, not between an heiress and a mechanic, but between two people who had chosen truth over power, authenticity over empire, and found something stronger than wealth or status in the process. The Reynolds Industrial Complex stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its silhouette unchanged, but its heart transformed. Inside its walls, a new legacy was taking shape, one built not on secrets and control, but on transparency and trust. And at its center, a woman who had finally found her truth by daring to live a lie.